Hey guys, Molten here and welcome back to this video in pawn majorities. So I'll be going through two different examples in this video, one on queenside and another one on kingside pawn majorities, and I'll talk through the differences as we go. So be sure to stick around to the very end and you'll learn exactly how to implement these into your own games. So the first example here is from a game played between Frank Marshall and Capablanca with the black pieces. We can see that black has reached this sort of middle game, end game. The queens are still on the board, but black has this 3v2 pawn majority on the queen side. And one of the first concepts I want you to understand in your games is to focus on pushing pawns on the side where you're strongest. So here, if you have more pawns on the queen side, that should be your main focus, generally speaking. And in terms of queenside pawn majorities, these are usually the preferred ones, especially in end games. Kingside pawn majorities, as we'll see, tends to lead to more of a attack in the early middle game, especially with queens on. It can be very effective. So in this particular position, Capablanca continued rook a to b8, protecting the pawn, getting ready to support the push of the b pawn. Queen to e4, queen to c7. So Capablanca wastes no time unpinning from potential f4 threats, and now the queen is ready to support c4. b5 is played, a3. Immediately Capablanca plays the move pawn to c4. So we can see that the pawn on c4 stops the white pawn on the b file from moving up the board. Also, the bishop is doing a great job of supporting this pawn. Bishop f3, rook to d8. So we take the open d file, rook to d1. We have captures, and then rook to d8, getting a free tempo on the bishop. Bishop to f3, g6, queen c6. We avoid the queen trade. Queen goes back, and now he accepts it in a more favorable situation, and the rook comes into the back rank with check. And a5. So we see that white hasn't made much progress on the king side. It's very hard to do so in an endgame like this, when the queen side, I believe, is a lot more dangerous. And here, Capablanca's job is really to create some dangerous threats on the queen side and eventually push through one of his passed pawns. That should be the main goal. Rook c2, continues on with b4. Pawn takes, bishop f3. And it's very important here that you tie your opponent's pieces down, so Capablanca does not bring the rook back along the d file. Instead, he plays the move rook to b1, just putting pressure on this b2 pawn. And we can see that white will play the move bishop to e2, but he doesn't have enough time to take the pawn on c4 because of all the pressure on b2. So black plays the move pawn to b3. The rook has to slide across to d2. And now rook c1. So black's threatening to play the move rook to c2, offering this exchange of rooks, which white cannot accept because then black will promote a pawn on c1 square. So white has to play the move bishop to b1 here. And now because the bishop is being attacked by the rook, black has a nice tactic to push through. Plays the move pawn to c3. Takes, b2, rook takes, and then black captures the bishop on d1. So there's no way for white there to actually stop the pawn. He had to capture. Rook to c2 was played, but now black is up a bishop, and because there's still quite a number of pawns on the board, the conversion shouldn't be overly difficult. Again, black ties down the pawn and then starts attacking the king side. h5. The king is sort of in Zugzwang now because we're threatening bishop h5, followed by rook takes pawn. And we see black collect a few of the pawns on the king side. And then finally, white resigns here. So we can see just how dangerous the queenside pawns are, especially in an endgame. So now we're going to move on to kingside pawn majorities. So in the following position, we can see that all the pieces are still on the board, and it's white to move. So how would you, as white, create a kingside pawn majority? So here, the best move for white is to play pawn to e5, so not capturing on d5, instead just passing by, and now we've created a 4v3 on the king side. So here. Also notice black's knight on g6 isn't a particularly good piece because it doesn't have too many squares to go to, and now white is creating a very dangerous threat of f4, f5, chasing this knight away, and if you can get the pawn to f6 as well, this is a very key idea when you're attacking your opponent's king on the king side. If you ever can get a pawn to f6, it creates very strong and dangerous threats for your opponent. So here, black played the move knight to f4 in order to stop white from pushing forward with f4. And white's idea would be to get rid of this knight, but we don't really want to trade too many pieces. So white could play the move knight to e2 and try to get rid of this knight, but he doesn't want to trade pieces. Also, the pawn on a3 is currently hanging. So he plays the move rook to e1 first. The idea is that first he wants to chase this knight away with queen to d2, but in order to chase this knight away, he needs to play the move knight to d2. But he can't yet play knight to d2 because there's a knight to e3 threat. So rook e1 is preparing knight to d2. g6 was played. Knight to d2 was played. b5. White captures, and then queen to d2. So the most important thing here for white is to get rid of this knight in order to push his pawn majority. Giving black a passed pawn here on c4 doesn't really mean too much because in the long run it's not going to be able to be utilized because white's attack is far too strong and it's coming very quickly. Knight to e6 was played, and immediately the white queen jumps into the h6 square, taking advantage of the weak and dark squares here on the king side. And white has some very strong immediate threats here of f4, f5, f6, as well as ideas of knight h5, as well as knight to f5 and knight to e4. So black is in a lot of danger here. Rook to f8 was played, and white has a couple of ways here to create a winning attack, but white opts for the move knight to f5. So there's no need to push the f pawn anymore because white has both knight h5 and knight f5 good enough to win the game right away. Here knight f5 is attacking the rook, and the rook is just very short on squares. So one of the ideas is that if black plays the move rook to e8, then the idea is not to go knight to e6, but instead white wants to continue his attack with a very strong rook lift, rook to e4, and the rook will swing across to h4, and here white has a very strong attack which is unstoppable. In the game black took, white took back on f5, and already black chose to resign because there's no way for him to defend the f7 pawn without playing f6. But after f6, white will just take this pawn. And now there's threats on the e6 pawn as well as threats on the rook, threats on g7, h7. So black called it quits. So as you can see, there's some distinct differences between kingside and queenside pawn majorities. Kingside pawn majorities tend to lead towards a middle game attack or initiative against the king, especially if they're castled on the same sides. And queenside pawn majorities tend to favor more towards the late middle game and end game, generally speaking. But the overall concept is exactly the same. You should be focusing on pushing pawns on the side where you're definitely the strongest. So I hope you learned something from this video. If you did and enjoyed it, please consider giving a thumbs up down below. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one in the series.